There were two great wars in the 20th century. The first one, of course, began at around 1914, and the second one began in 1939. Now, the United States of America entered those two conflicts well after they had started. The United States entered World War I in 1917 and entered World War II in 1941. In both cases, in order to bring the United States into those two wars, there had to be something that happened that brought America into those wars. With World War I, it was the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania. With World War II, the event that brought America into the Second World War, of course, was the bombing at Pearl Harbor. Now, both of those events, the United States government knew completely about. They knew the Lusitania was going to be sunk, and they knew Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. But the United States government allowed those things to happen. Why? Because when they did that, it created in the American mind, they said, oh, we've got to go to war now because American interests are under attack. Now you say, well, Bill, why are you talking about this? Did you notice somebody at the United Nations this week telling the UN and the American people why we need to go to war with Iraq? Now, did you notice that the guy didn't get very far? He's not getting very far, is he? And there doesn't appear to be a lot of public opinion on his side. Well, you know what, folk? This is called a great big game. Because what they're doing is all of the people at the UN, you know whose side they're on? They're on George Bush's side. And guess what? They're also on Saddam Hussein's side. You say, wait a minute, I thought George Bush and Saddam Hussein were against each other. No, they're not. Because Saddam Hussein and George Bush are working for the same people. They're working for the same leader. And that leader is called the Black Pope. Both of those men are run by the Jesuit general in Rome. And so what it appears like right now is that George Bush wants to just let Saddam Hussein have it. When in actuality, what is going on, folk, is this. Now, I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet, but mark my words. I honestly believe that George Bush is not going to get public opinion on his side. And so what is going to happen is, in order to bring America into a Middle Eastern war with Iraq, there's going to be some tragedy. There's going to be some awful thing that's going to take place in a U.S. embassy or on U.S. soil. And in the aftermath of that event, you know what's going to happen? Guess who's going to go to war with Iraq? The United States of America. Yes, they will, Nancy. Now, something else I want you to keep in mind in this buffoonery and in the lies that are being perpetrated in the press, over TV, over radio, in the magazines, is this. The issue for why there must be a Middle Eastern war. Folk, you and I understand where we are. We saw it this morning in that news clip, didn't we? We're on the brink of American politicians and religious leaders talking about what? What are they talking about? They're talking about Sunday legislation. Now, what does the world believe has to happen before Jesus can come? What do they believe has got to happen? Okay. Okay, there's got to be a man of peace. That's true. There's going to be the mark of the beast. But folk, before the devil impersonates Christ on this earth, there has to be a false Armageddon. Okay? See, every major event in the great controversy has a counterfeit, doesn't it? Every single one. So the devil is going to impersonate Christ and say, I am Christ. To say that Jesus has come a second time, isn't he? Great controversy tells us that. Before that happens, there will be a false Armageddon. And where will that false Armageddon be fought? It'll be fought in the Middle East. And there will be bloodshed, and there will be death by the thousands and thousands of people. Well, you know what? You and I know we're coming to those very events. You see it in this Sunday law possibility being discussed next month in Washington, D.C. So there's got to be a false Armageddon, which will be carried out in the Middle East. And what man who would be more perfectly set up to create all of that but Saddam Hussein? And so George Bush, Saddam Hussein, they're all working for the same Jesuit general. They're being told exactly what to do. They will create a war in the Middle East. The United States, the Israelites, the Iraqis, the Palestinians, the Syrians, there will be a general engagement in that part of the world. It will be called the false Armageddon, and then who will come? The devil will impersonate Christ right there in the Middle East. That's where he will appear the first time. Now, we also know something else from Alberto Rivera's magazine called The Godfathers. In his little magazine, Alberto Rivera says that the papacy has wanted to rule the world from Jerusalem since the 3rd century. Well, how is all the world going to be so brainwashed as to believe that the Pope can come to Jerusalem to rule the world? What has to happen in that part of the world? There's got to be complete devastation. Because when people start throwing missiles, as Saddam Hussein is declaring he will do, and as he talks about germ and biological warfare, do you know what the world's going to do in a short matter of time? We're going to watch on CNN or ABC, we're going to see corpses just laying flat in that area of the world. And you know what the cry of the earth is going to be? We've got to have a peacemaker to come to the Middle East. And who do you think the peacemaker is going to be? It's going to be the Pope of Rome. And so, the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church, they've got Saddam Hussein in this pocket. They've got George Bush in this pocket. They're telling them both exactly what to do. They've got Ariel Sharon, Yasser Arafat in their back pockets. And they're saying, create a bloodbath in the Middle East. Because we want to bring the Pope to Jerusalem. And so, all of us are sitting back and they're saying, wow, Saddam Hussein, he's a bad guy. He's a big bully. He's a mean guy. And George Bush, he's just fighting against the renegade. Well, you know what? That's exactly what the Jesuit-controlled press wants you to think. That's exactly, if you believe that, then they've got you in this pocket right here. They've got you in their pocket. And you know what, folks? If we embrace the lies of the media today, you know what? What does Revelation 13 says? It says, and deceiveth them by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast. We can be deceived. You see? The issue is over deception. The devil saying to us through the Jesuit-controlled press, everything's over here, this is where the problem is, when really it's all the way over here. You see? So folk, don't embrace what the Jesuit-controlled press is telling you. They're trying to create a scenario to bring the Pope to Jerusalem to rule the world. And you know what? They will kill and maim and destroy however many millions of people they have to in order to see that happen. So don't be bamboozled by the deceptions of the Jesuit-controlled press that somehow George Bush is a good guy and Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. That's not the case. They're both bad guys. They're both bad guys. They're both working for the Jesuit general, and they're both working for the rise of the Pope in Jerusalem to prepare the world to receive the devil when he impersonates Christ. That's what's going on today. Now, we continually are hearing, and I'm eventually going to get to my topic. I'm not there yet. But this is we're living this today. We're living this right now, and we need to understand what's going on, or we could be deceived. We could end up on the wrong side when this is all over. Now, we're constantly being told about another terrorist attack on the United States, and who's the mean old bully that's doing it? It's that guy in Iraq. We've got to get rid of that guy in Baghdad because he's causing all... Do you believe that? If you do, I've got a bridge in Brooklyn, New York, and I want to sell it to you. That's a bunch of baloney. It's a bunch of baloney. What is really going on is this. Another terrorist attack created, planned by the Jesuit order and the high-up ranking officials in not the Iraqi government, but the United States government. And I'll show you that in just a little while here today. High-ranking officials in this nation, in cahoots with the Jesuit order, will create another terrorist attack in this country. Why? Two reasons. I believe with all my heart that it's going to fulfill two purposes. Number one, there will be another terrible catastrophe in this country. Why? Because then George Bush will get up on all the news networks and he will tell the UN and all the people of America and the world, he'll say, see, I told you what a bad guy Saddam was. See what he's done in our country? Now we have to go to war. See how that could work so easy? The Jesuit general tells his people exactly what they are supposed to do. They don't have to know all the details. The people way up, they know the details. How much Saddam Hussein and George Bush know, that I'm not sure of. But they know who they're working for, and they know they're working for the same team. Absolutely. You see, Nancy, if you go back to Revelation chapter 17, you will find, in fact, before we take a look in Revelation chapter 17, let's kneel together. Loving Father in heaven, We live in a moment of Earth's history where cunning, deception, devilry, and trickery of every kind, we are being absolutely bombarded with it every single day. Father in heaven, we pray for the Holy Spirit as you admonished those living in the period of Earth's history, of church history, known as the Laodiceans. You said to pray that you could have your eyes anointed with eye salve, that you might see. Father, we need your eye salve today. We have never needed it more. We're being lied to constantly. The devil is seeking by whatever mechanism possible to destroy the remnant people. Father, I pray that you would anoint our eyes today, that we might see, that we might understand what's really going on, so that we can stand on the right side for the right team in these closing hours of Earth's history. Bless us and tear away the blinders that we could discern your hand in this earth today. In Jesus' name, amen. Let me state one other thing, and then we'll look in Revelation 17. There will be two purposes for another terrorist attack in this country. One is to be able to push public opinion and world opinion so that there is a war in the Middle East. The other reason for a terrorist attack on American soil is to get Americans to the place where the fear factor is so great that they will say to the American politicians and religious leaders, "Here are my freedoms. You do with me whatever you will. Just let me be safe in this country." And so we will have, by another terrorist attack in this country, we will have a twofold thing take place. It will be blamed on the bully of Iraq, while the bully in Washington, D.C. will use it to start the false Armageddon in the Middle East, and also to bring about Sunday worship in this country. That's what will happen, I believe. Now, Saddam Hussein, George Bush, Tony Blair, Yasser Arafat, Ariel Sharon, all the leaders of earth. Revelation 17 verses 12 and 13. Notice what it says. It says, "The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast." Now those verses are talking about a time in Earth's history that we are living in today, in which the governments of this world are giving their political power to the Catholic Church for the final time. And that is why we have such union in our world today, at least at the United Nations for the most part, is because of the fact that all of these kings and all of these leaders, they all have one purpose, and that is to give their political power back to Rome. Verse 13 says they have one mind. Ellen White in 7a of the Bible Commentary, commenting on this verse, she says, "There will be a universal bond of union, one great harmony." A universal bond? Yeah. There's a universal bond amongst all the leaders of earth today to do exactly what the Jesuit order tells them to do. There is a unity. You know, we were tricked for about the last year. We've been told that there's another evil man in the Middle East. And what was his name? Osama bin Laden. What an awful man he was. Look what he... Did you believe that? Did you realize that Osama bin Laden has business connections with the Bush family? Folk, they're working together. They're business partners. So why is George Bush telling us that we've got to hunt down Osama bin Laden? Why? Because it's fomenting war in the Middle East, isn't it? It's brainwashing us to think we've got to have war in the Middle East. And it's also, thanks to Osama bin Laden, we saw freedoms disappearing after September 11th. And so Osama bin Laden, he's pretty much used up his ability to deceive America. Now we need somebody worse than Osama bin Laden. And so who are we going to use now? Well, let's use good old Saddam Hussein of Iraq. So, folk, we live in an awesome moment. But Saddam Hussein, make no mistake about it, Saddam Hussein, George Bush, Tony Blair, and all the rest of them, they're on the same team. And that team is called the Jesuit Order of the Catholic Church. That's the team they're on. George Bush is not a goody-goody because he lives in the White House, and Saddam Hussein is not a bad boy because he lives in Baghdad. Those both are working to destroy liberty in America and to bring about Sunday worship and to bring about the false Armageddon that will usher in the manifestation of the devil as Christ. They're both working for that same purpose. So, away with the buffoonery that says that Saddam Hussein is a bad guy and George Bush is a good guy. That is a lie. Now, having said all that, let's get to our meeting for this afternoon. I want to look at something with you this afternoon. In fact, I want to look at a man. He was called the Holy Monk. His name was Edward Mandell House. You say, well, Bill, I've lived this long in my life. I haven't heard of him, and I don't need to hear of him. Well, hold on with me a little while, because I think you'll be able to see with me that his name is Edward Mandell House. Edward Mandell House. You say, but Bill, he has no influence. The guy is dead. And you're talking about somebody dead and we've got Bible prophecy going on right before our eyes? Well, you know what? Edward Mandell House was a pivotal person in bringing about what we have in America today. Edward Mandell House, and I'm getting most of my information from this book called The Creature from Jekyll Island. If you don't have this book, you need to get it. The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Another book I'm going to be referring to is a book called Why a Bankrupt America by Jack Newell and Devi Kidd. I want to tell you some things about Edward Mandell House and how he relates to us today. Edward Mandell House basically ran the United States from 1913 to 1921. Now, for those of you who have taken United States history, Who was the President of the United States between 1913 and 1921? Who was it? Say it again. Woodrow Wilson. That's exactly right, David. Woodrow Wilson was the president between 1913 and 1921. Now, Woodrow Wilson was gotten into the White House, according to this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. He was gotten into the White House by Edward Mandell House. And once Woodrow Wilson was elected to the presidency, the man who actually ran America was Edward Mandell House. It wasn't Woodrow Wilson. In fact, Woodrow Wilson made a statement, and I've read it in a couple of books, where he stated this. He said, Edward Mandell House is my second self. He is my alter ego. Now that's what Woodrow Wilson said about Edward Mandell House, that House was his alter ego. It is told in this book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, that in 1915, Woodrow Wilson was running for his second term of office. And as he went out to give speeches to the American people, Woodrow Wilson said, I have kept you out of war. Therefore, vote for me in the coming election of 1916. While Woodrow Wilson was going around giving those speeches, Edward Mandell House was over in Europe secretly negotiating with England and France as to how they could best bring America into the First World War. So in America, Wilson was saying, I've kept you out of war, vote for me again. And Edward Mandell House, his alter ego, was planning to bring America into the war right after the election. Now it's very interesting. Edward Mandell House was raised in Texas. As a young man, he was sent over to Europe. And while he was in Europe, Edward Mandell House became very close to many, many wealthy people in Europe. He became very, very close to people like the Rothschilds and the Warburgs, who basically controlled the financial picture of Europe. And it was through that connection that Edward Mandell House began to actually work for the Jesuit order and the Rothschilds in the United States. Now, you say, wait a minute, Bill. Wait a minute. You just said that the Rothschilds worked for the Jesuit order, that they're connected to the Jesuit order? That is exactly what I just said. I want to read to you from a book called Rulers of Evil by F. Tupper Saucy. F. Tupper Saucy, pages 160 and 161. Notice what it says. Aware that the Rothschilds are an important Jewish family, I looked them up in the Encyclopedia Judaica and discovered that they bear the title. Now guess what title the Rothschilds hold? Their title is Guardians of the Vatican Treasury. The Vatican Treasury, of course, holds the imperial wealth of Rome. The appointment of Rothschild gave the Black Papacy absolute financial privacy and secrecy. Who would ever search a family of Orthodox Jews for the keys to the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church? Who do the Rothschilds work for? Who do they work for? They hold the key to the Vatican treasury. Now, when F. Tupper Saucy in there said that the black papacy uses the Rothschilds, what is the black papacy? It's simply, that's right, it's the Jesuit general who hides in the darkness. It's the man who we never see and nobody knows anything about. The one who's out in front, John Paul at this point, he's known as the White Pope because he's right out there in the sunlight of noonday. But the Jesuit general, the Black Pope, he's lurking behind the scenes and nobody knows what he's doing. And so when F. Tupper Saucy says that the Rothschild family is a perfect cover for the black papacy, that's what he's talking about. So the Rothschilds and their incredible wealth. I was reading a book on the way home on the airplane. I didn't bring it with me. It's called The Rothschild Money Trust. Today in our world, the Rothschild family owns at least 60 to 75% of the accumulated wealth of this planet. Now let me say that again. The Rothschild family owns at least 60 to 75% of the accumulated wealth of this planet. And according to F. Tupper Saucy, who has their grimy hands in 3/4 of the world's wealth? The Vatican does. The Vatican does. You know, in the days of Daniel Webster in about the 1820s here in the United States, Daniel Webster made the comment where he said, in fact it's in this book, Creature from Jekyll Island, he said that by the 1820s, at least 3/4 of the representatives of our nation were in the Jesuits' back pocket. The Rothschilds controlled the Congress of the United States in the 1820s. From the very beginning, Charles Chiniquy tells us in the book 50 Years in the Church of Rome, the papacy realized that either America would survive and the papacy be destroyed, or the papacy would survive and America would be destroyed. Because the two groups believe in the exact opposite things. The papacy in total domination, whereas America has stood for freedom. Either one of those two ideologies would win, but they couldn't both win. So the papacy from the very beginning sought to destroy America, and what better way to do it than to buy off politicians who would vote the way the papacy wanted them to vote. Think about that. What better way to do it than to buy off politicians? You say, but Bill, there's got to be some that were honest. Yeah, there were. You know what happened to them? They were shot. They were poisoned. They were run over. In this book I was reading, The Rothschild Money Trust, in the early 1930s, there were 3 prominent senators, and I could get you their names. 3 prominent senators who opposed FDR's New Deal that would create a socialistic climate in the United States that would make people dependent on the government instead of upon themselves. 3 senators opposed his New Deal. You know what happened to him? Amazing. Within a very short period of time, they died. They died. They were all murdered. They were all murdered because they opposed the Catholic New Deal for America. 3 senators. Edward Mandell House was very much influenced by the Rothschilds, became one of their agents, and then thus he became an agent of the Jesuit order to destroy the United States. He had 8 years to do it under Woodrow Wilson. Edward Mandell House wrote a book called Philip Drew, the Administrator. It was basically a biography about his own life and his own goals. In the book, Edward Mandell House wanted to do a couple of things. One, he wanted to get an income tax passed so that all Americans would have to pay income tax. You know, Americans didn't do that before about 1916. Did you know that? That's what Edward Mandell House wanted to do, to hoist it onto the American people. Another thing he said in his book was he wanted to control both the Democratic and the Republican parties. So that Americans, when they vote, like in the last election, when somebody would go to the polls and vote for George Bush, they'd think they were still voting for a Republican. And those who voted for Al Gore would say, I'm a staunch Democrat. And the people in Washington are sitting there laughing at the American people. Why? Because they control both parties. And no matter what person is voted into office, they're still going to promote the same agenda of the Jesuit order. So it didn't make any difference whether George Bush got into office or whether Al Gore got into office. They were still going to destroy freedom in America. And you know what? That has been going on in America for the last 70 years. Americans have been lied to that you have a voice in the political process. The other thing that Edward Mandell House wanted to do is he wanted to create a central bank, a Federal Reserve Bank in the United States. Sounds like Edward Mandell House got what he wanted, doesn't it? That's because he had American politicians in the palm of his hand, because he had their wallets. The other thing Edward Mandell House wanted to do is he wanted to destroy the liberties that Americans have and create a Marxist government. Now, Edward Mandell House was the chief proponent. After World War I, the Jesuit order used Edward Mandell House to create the League of Nations. And of course what happened was the people were crying out after World War I saying, we're just fed up with war, we want to have peace. And so Edward Mandell House, the Jesuit, came forward and said, the way to do it is to have a League of Nations. Let's have all the nations come together. Well, you know what? The American people said, no. We're not going to get into the League of Nations. We want to own our sovereignty as a nation. And so the League of Nations sputtered and it died. But you know what? The Jesuit order and their pawns in the United States government, did they quit? No. What they decided to do was they said, we're going to create another war. And we're going to make it so bad that when the war is over, the people of this country and all over the world will say, oh yes, we've got to have a united group of governments to be together. And we're going to call it the United Nations. You know the thing that's so devastating about that? Not only does it destroy the sovereignty of nations, but it was a creation of the Jesuit order. And Jan Paulson, at the General Conference session in Toronto in, the year 2000, Jan Paulson, as the president of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists, got up, had a representative of the UN speak at the session, and when he was done, he said, "We thank you for being God's instrument of peace in this world." So a Jesuit-controlled organization, according to Jan Paulson, is God's instrument of peace in this world. Now, if you believe that, I've got two bridges. Edward Mandell House was a sharp cookie. So what he did after World War I, when the League of Nations failed, he got his men together, amongst whom were people like John Foster Dulles, who became the Secretary of State under Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allen Dulles, who became one of the first leaders of the Central Intelligence Agency. These were people who rose to high positions in America. And these people are fulfilling the Jesuit plan for America. You know what you call people like that? They're called traitors. They're called 20th century Benedict Arnolds. That's what they are. They're traitors. So all these people came together, and Edward Mandell House said, "Okay, we missed it the first time, but we're not going to miss it next time." And so Edward Mandell House, he created an organization, and it was called the CFR. How many of you have heard of the CFR? Okay, a lot of us have. CFR means the Council on Foreign Relations. And the simple purpose for the CFR is to destroy the sovereignty of the United States and to make the United States a slave nation of the United Nations. That was the purpose of the CFR. Now in England, they have a sister organization that does the same thing, and it's called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. The RIIA does the same thing in England as the CFR does in America. And what was the Council on Foreign Relations going to do? Well, when you have 3/4 of the world's wealth in your pocket, what are you going to do? You're going to get together people in business, people in politics, and people in the media who are intelligent, who write well, who speak well, who are charismatic, and you're going to sit down with them and you're going to say, "Now, brother, how would you like to live in the nicest section of town? How would you like to have the highest position in your state or in this company? Or how would you like to be the anchor of CBS? Or how would you like to be the main man at CNN?" And then they pull out their wad of bills in their back pocket and they start dropping them on the table. Okay? Now, if somebody does not have principle, what are they going to do? They're going to say, "I'll do whatever you say." Well, you know what? How many people do we have in Congress today that have made that very statement? How about the man from Massachusetts that's been there for ages by the name of Teddy Kennedy? Teddy Kennedy has been bought off. You know why? Because Teddy Kennedy knows if he doesn't accept the payoff, you know what's going to happen to him? It's the same thing that happened to his brothers and his nephew is going to happen to him. That's why he's turned to alcohol. That's why he's turned to womanizing. Because the man is running scared. And how many other hundreds of people in politics, in the media, in business, how many of the rest of them have been bought off? Folk, that's what the CFR did. And if anybody who was approached didn't go along with it, well, what would happen to them? All of a sudden, they'd run for office. They'd been a senator for 3 terms. And all of a sudden, this most popular senator would lose in his state by a landslide. Or, for some reason, the mortgage on his house, the bank would call for his mortgage and he'd have to make an immediate payment or he'd lose his home. Just these incredible things would happen to people who wouldn't go along with the CFR. You say, Bill, I can't believe that there could be Americans that have American blood running through their veins who would do such a thing. Oh, really? John Wilkes Booth had American blood in his veins. Did it stop him from pulling a trigger and then killing Abraham Lincoln? Did it stop the people on the grassy knoll who put an end to John F. Kennedy's life? No. This is what the CFR did. This is what the CFR does. William Jefferson Clinton, to give you a modern illustration, was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Do you know what happened to people who didn't go along with William Jefferson Clinton? Go to the internet and look up the list of well over 100 people who are known to have died premature deaths because of their opposition to Bill Clinton. That was the organization that Edward Mandell House created under the auspices of the Jesuit order in 1921. Now can you understand why I say to you that the people on CBS, Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather, the people on CNN, Time, Newsweek, the Orlando Sentinel, the LA Times, Life Mag, all of these things are telling you exactly the lie the Jesuits want you to hear? Do you understand now why I say that? Because the CFR holds those groups in the palm of their hand. And that was the creation of Jesuit, the holy monk, Edward Mandell House. Now, a few statements from people who knew about the CFR. This first one is from Carol Quigley. Maybe some of you remember that name. Carol Quigley was a professor of history at Georgetown University. Carol Quigley was a Jesuit. He trained Bill Clinton. This is what Carol Quigley said about the CFR. The CFR is the American branch of a society which originated in England and which believes that national boundaries should be obliterated and a one-world rule established. Now, who does the CFR think should rule the world? Who's going to rule the world when the CFR has a one-world global government? Who's going to rule the world as its only leader? Who is it?
The man of peace.
The man of peace. So who is behind the CFR and the United Nations? Thank you. Another interesting thing about the United Nations, it says the land that the United Nations headquarters sits on was donated by John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller, by the way, is an agent of the Jesuit order, and they're using their wealth to destroy this nation. It says this: the land where the United Nations headquarters sits is located in New York City. They do not hide their goal for disarming the American citizens. In front of the UN building is a statue of a Colt revolver with the barrel twisted in a knot. Twisted in a knot? What good is a gun that's twisted in a knot? It's no good at all. That's exactly right. And the point of this, and the reason they have a twisted gun in front of the UN, is because the UN wants to disarm every citizen in this world. You know why? Because if you disarm the citizenry, then who's going to stop tyranny from walking through your front door? You see? Now you say, well, Bill, are you advocating that I go out and get a six-shooter? No, I'm not. I don't have one. I'll never get one because I don't believe those are my weapons. But the United Nations is geared to destroy that freedom that we have as Americans. Chester Ward, a Rear Admiral, a former member of the CFR for 16 years, said, the most powerful clique in these elitist groups have one objective in mind. They want to bring about the surrender of the sovereignty of the independence of the United States. The Jesuit order of the Catholic Church has wanted to destroy the middle class and to create a feudal system like there was during the Dark Ages from the very beginnings of this country. That's why NAFTA happened. That's why the GATT, that's right, the thank you, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, NAFTA, all of those are designed for one purpose. That is to make America a slave nation, to destroy the Protestant middle class. That was another purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations. Sounds like a great group, doesn't it? Yeah. You know, I heard a story, and I don't remember who told me. I think it was my dear friend in California. He said, you know, I heard that Rush Limbaugh, who, by the way, is another Jesuit agent in the United States. He is a Jesuit agent. Sean Hannity, a Jesuit agent on the radio. Folk, let me tell you something. As I found out a few weeks ago, unless you quote the party line, how long do you stay on the air? How long? About 40 minutes? They gave me 47. All right, I got 7 extra. 47 minutes. Folk, if Rush Limbaugh was not giving the party line, how long would he be on the air? He wouldn't be on the air because they've got 100 other people right behind him ready to take his place. Rush Limbaugh was told at one point by I guess it was David Rockefeller, he was told categorically, if somebody ever brings up the CFR, you cut them off. They don't want this known about the Council on Foreign Relations. James Madison, a great United States patriot, James Madison once made the comment, and I will paraphrase, he said, "The system of checks and balances that we have established in America is to help save this country from tyranny in the hands of the few." Well, you know what the CFR is? It is tyranny in the hands of the few. That's what it is. The ultimate aim of the CFR is to create a one-world socialist system and to make the U.S. an official part of it. Now, another statement. This is from the book I mentioned at the front called Why a Bankrupt America by Jack Newell and Devi Kidd. They declared the members of the CFR dominate almost every aspect of American life. One reason that most Americans have never heard of the Council on Foreign Relations is because there are over 170 journalists, correspondents, and communications executives who are members of the CFR. Would it surprise you if I told you that Tom Brokaw is a member of the CFR? And when was the last time you heard Tom Brokaw tell you that George Bush and Saddam Hussein are working to establish the Pope in Jerusalem? Was it last week or the week before? Why aren't they telling us? Because they are feeding us the lies that their Jesuit masters are telling them to say. David Rockefeller is the chairman of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. That shouldn't surprise anybody. Some of the current members or past members of the CFR, just let me name a few of them for you. Patrick Moynihan from New York, a senator. John Chaffee, a senator from Rhode Island. Joseph Lieberman, senator from Connecticut. Do you remember him? Vice presidential candidate with Al Gore, a CFR member. George Bush, a CFR member. Dick Cheney, a CFR member. Al Gore, a CFR member. What difference who gets into office? They're all CFR members. They're all going to do the same thing. Three Supreme Court justices, Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Stephen Breyer, all CFR members. Newt Gingrich, Thomas Foley, Richard Gephardt, and Larry Pressler. And then it says Warren Christopher. This was under Bill Clinton, Secretary of State Warren Christopher. Secretary of the Treasury, Richard Rubin, I believe his first name was. CIA Director Deutsch, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Donna Shalala. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Barry Cisneros. All CFR members. Pushing whose agenda? Pushing to protect the freedoms of Americans. Pushing the Jesuit agenda to destroy this nation and to prepare us to receive the mark of the beast. That's what this is all about. And the high-ups in this nation are not the good guys. George Bush is not the good guy. Dick Cheney is not the good guy. Tom Brokaw is not the good guy that we start buddying up with. We need to buddy up with the captain of the host of the Lord. Because he's the one that's going to take us through the promised land, and he's going to tell us the truth. He's not going to lie to us. So Edward Mandell House, though dead, his principles still live on in the hearts of the Black Pope and in the hearts of the traitors that stand at the head of the United States government. May God help each one of us to listen to his voice and to ask that He would anoint our eyes with eye salve so that we can see clearly what's going on today.